All right, welcome everyone who's tuning into this session on climate change and implications for trade policy. And we're very happy to have Professor Mark Howden with us today to talk about this topic. Professor Mark Howden is Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University, and also Honorary Professor at the Melbourne University. Not only that, he has also been Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as you know, the IPCC is the international body that hopefully everyone listens to when they get together at the different conferences of the parties to move policy on climate change further. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Mark.
Thanks very much, Stephen, for that introduction, and thanks to the organisers for having me here today. So today I'm going to cover what is actually a pretty complex and very rapidly evolving area, and I'll do that from the perspective of a sort of a climate and environment scientist. That's my background. I'm not a trade economist or an international policy expert, although I have paddled in those waters every now and again. So I'll just share my screen, and hopefully that will work. So is that a full screen there, Stephen?
Yes.
Perfect. So yes, today, as Stephen said, I'm just talking about climate change and the implications for trade, particularly sort of taking a New Zealand and to some extent Australian approach to this. But the first thing point I'd make is that the emission trajectories, which have been the conversation centre of discussions at Glasgow Conference of Parties, for example, they themselves have huge implications for trade over the next decade to centuries. And I thought it was really important to put up this diagram. So this diagram shows carbon dioxide emissions from industry and fossil fuel usage, so cement manufacturing, coal-fired power, that sort of thing, in billions of tonnes a year. And you can see that we're sort of very different trajectories are being explored here. So in this particular case, we go from the current emissions, which are about 40 billion tonnes a year, up very high if we go on the high emission scenario, or if we comply with the Paris Agreement, we go on the very low emission scenarios. So we don't know where we're going to go. So that's why they're scenarios, not predictions. But the outcomes in terms of climate change are tremendously different. And so if we go on a high emission scenario, so sort of essentially keep the historical trends going, then we end up a world which is 4 or 5 degrees warmer, and 4 or 5 degrees is a massive, massive change, which will effectively change the face of the world, not just for decades, but for centuries to come. If we do want to actually comply with the Paris Agreement commitments, which is keeping global temperatures down well below 2 degrees and if possible to 1.5 degrees, we've got to go on the 2 low emission scenarios, the low or very low emission scenarios. So get off the trajectory we're on, and which at a minimum is the orange one, which would lead us to say 3 degrees of temperature change, and get onto the low or very low ones, which lead to 2 degrees or 1.5. Now you'll notice from this graph that if we want to meet the Paris Agreement commitment of 1.5 degrees, we effectively have to go net zero by 2050. If it's 2 degrees, it's net zero by 2070. And in both cases, that's not the end of the journey. We have to keep going. We have to actually go below net zero. We have to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, a few points about that. Firstly is that the change between how we're structuring our economy and how we're powering our economy through energy versus what we need to do to stick with the Paris Agreements is massive, absolutely massive, and will result in huge change in its own right, which will have huge trade implications. Secondly is that we simply don't have the technologies sorted out at this point in time, which we can actually achieve all of this. We can achieve some of those emission reductions, but not necessarily all. And we don't have at scale the technologies needed to do the negative emissions to the billions of tonnes a year that we're likely to need it. So of course, that has huge implications in terms of trade, in terms of opportunities for business, and in terms of changing the relationships between the competitiveness of different countries. So I think I've got 4 slides here. The first one that I'd want to point out is climate change itself will influence trade and commodity prices. So it will do this directly through the impacts of climate change. So as climate change is already impacting on, say, agriculture, and that's the map down below, that is already changing supply and demand of agricultural products. So that map down below is a very recent study which shows how climate change has already impacted on agriculture productivity across the globe, country by country. And on average, that's actually driven down productivity by 21% compared with what it would otherwise be. So this particular study, what it did was it took out from agricultural statistics, it took out the signal from the management and technology improvements, which tend to push productivity up, and then disentangled the climate signal from the residue. And this is what we see here. And you can see that climate change is already impacting massively. So a couple of countries, those in the high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere, they're actually advantaged by climate change, whereas most other countries, including New Zealand and Australia, are very much disadvantaged by climate change already. And some countries, such as Central America and parts of Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, are extraordinarily disadvantaged by climate change. Their productivity would have been much higher than what we've observed in the absence of climate change. So obviously that is by itself going to impact on trade. Now, when we actually look out into the future, these sorts of trends are likely to increase and increase very significantly. So of course that means that's going to have trade implications, so shifting of different commodities at different times. It's going to have price implications. So as supply and demand move, and generally speaking, those prices are likely to go up due to climate change, including through increased costs of inputs. And it's going to impact on product quality and product variability of supply and other challenges. So for example, product supply, not just in agriculture, but in other industries, can be significantly affected by climate extremes. And what we see from climate change is those climate extremes, such as big cyclones or hurricanes, depending on where you are, or droughts or floods, can impact on supply chains, causing increased variability across those supply chains, as well as price implications. And the winners in this world will be those who adapt best to the changing environment. So it's those who look ahead and strategically position themselves for these changes. And that's a really important point, is that climate change responses are not just in terms of emission reductions, they're also in terms of adaptation to increasing climate risk that we see in many circumstances. We're also likely to see indirect implications for trade through greenhouse gas emission reduction activities. So it's going from one of those trajectories that I showed first up down to another trajectory, a much lower trajectory. And that, of course, is going to change the balances of competitiveness between nations, depending on their different emissions profiles. So the situation in New Zealand, where you've got a very, very large component of agricultural emissions, would be very different from, say, Singapore, where that's essentially non-existent. So how different countries will fare in this will depend particularly on their emissions profiles, but also in terms of the policies they put in place to change those profiles, so as to reduce their net greenhouse gas footprint on the globe. And this is going to play out in many different ways, not just the sort of Glasgow discussions that we see, different jostling of positions in terms of emission reductions and different greenhouse gases and different instruments, but also in things like shipping. So New Zealand, just like Australia, being essentially island nations, we're heavily dependent on shipping. Now, whether that's through an aeroplane or through boats, which is the bulk of things, it doesn't really matter, because each of those has an extremely large greenhouse gas footprint in its own right. So a really strategic approach to this would be, for example, joining in the Cloudbank Declaration, which was announced at Glasgow just a few weeks back, which is essentially setting up green shipping routes across the globe. So I think there's the proposal to set up 19 of these. And the idea here is to prioritize green shipping, that's very low greenhouse gas emission profile shipping, across these routes. And importantly, it means that at each of those shipping ports, at the end of those routes, you have the facilities that are appropriate for renewably powered ships. So it's things like green methanol, renewably generated methanol, or renewably generated ammonia to power green ships. And of course, there's going to be other agendas there, which might be things like putting on essentially like big kite surfing sails onto ships and slowing them down. So the time needed to move commodities across the globe could well increase, because the faster you run a ship, the more fuel it uses. So there's a lot of implications from climate change and climate change actions. And amongst other things, we're seeing the emergence of discussions about what we call carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are essentially tariffs put at particular borders to adjust for those industries internally, which are subject to, say, to a carbon price policy, so that external agents, countries who are exporting into that nation or that block of nations, don't have an unfair advantage, because those products come from countries which don't have a carbon price on production. So what this does, of course, is it's intended to level out the playing field, so that industries aren't disadvantaged by depending on where they are. But of course, in the process, what this does is it puts a huge amount of power in the hands of, say, the EU, when they're thinking about establishing these border adjustment mechanisms, depending on what commodities they apply this to and what rate they apply it to, and all of the details about the agreements. It also changes the way in which money flows. So, for example, if in Australia we put on a carbon price on our production systems, our government would receive those monies and then be able to channel those monies into other activities, including through socially or environmentally appropriate policies. But in the case of where we didn't apply that carbon price, then that may get applied in a place like the EU, and then they're going to be in receipt of those monies. So if you actually think about it, the impetus to actually align in terms of carbon prices in those circumstances will be heavily driven by trade, and it will be heavily driven by concerns about being disadvantaged by not taking appropriate domestic policies. And of course, that's going to impact on the relative positions of nations' trading arrangements and trading partners, but also in terms of competitors. So, for example, if a country like New Zealand had appropriate carbon prices that were recognised by the EU and a country like Australia didn't, then clearly that's going to advantage you compared with Australian products when you're actually exporting into that EU market. So there's a whole series of things which flow from these policy decisions. Now, I just want to focus a little bit on the global carbon trading regime that's emerging. So this was a long time coming. So it was initially tried to be developed in Paris, and that's in 2015. It's taken all this time to essentially get approved. It's one of the Paris rulebook arrangements. And what happened in Glasgow just a few weeks ago was essentially the framework for the global carbon market system was agreed. And in particular, what that does is establishes increased transparency, increased accountability, and reduced risk of double counting for emissions which are traded across national borders. So, for example, Brazil could sell carbon credits to the US to offset emissions in the US. Previous to that, there was a big debate about, in that circumstance, whether Brazil could both sell those carbon credits but also claim those carbon credits against its domestic emissions. Now, clearly, that's a case of double counting, which is now essentially ruled out by the agreed arrangements. Now, of course, that has implications for a country like New Zealand, where your land use change sector is quite significant in terms of its carbon sequestration, offsetting significant emissions elsewhere in your nation. But obviously, if you start to sell those credits to other countries, then you can't start to claim them against your own national greenhouse gas accounts. So even though that might benefit particular entities in terms of trade, it may not benefit New Zealand as a whole. And so it will be interesting to see the policy response to this. Embedded in that Paris Agreement arrangement was essentially a small transaction tax for market trades, emission trades, when done on the market itself. So this is essentially, say, a business trading and buying carbon credits from another business. But that the agreement under Paris, as I understand it, essentially says if there's a bilateral arrangement between governments and those trades are between governments, then essentially there is no transaction tax which is going to be placed on this. And that tax was actually going to be used for essentially good activities under climate change. Essentially, it was going to be used to fund climate adaptation activities in developing nations. And my last slide here is just, I think, really reinforcing how the mood has changed in terms of business and trade in relation to climate change over the last few years. So if you go back just a handful of years, essentially business was pretty resistant to a lot of climate change concerns and an imposition of particular agendas to reduce emissions. And that's by and large flipped very substantially. And in many ways now, responding to climate change through both greenhouse gas emission reduction and adaptation is seen as just good business practice. And in fact, there's a whole stack of parties, including some of these that I've listed here, shareholders, corporate investors like BlackRock, banks, insurance companies, consumers and regulators, and courts, all ramping up pressure on businesses to ensure that they're actually taking full account of climate change considerations in their strategic decision-making. So in fact, in Australia, a business that doesn't do this is potentially liable of breaching the Corporations Act within Australia, which is a criminal offence. I think we're likely to see increasing divestment of fossil fuel portfolios as this pressure starts to mount and as companies start to move away from fossil fuel intensive industries. And you'll see start of shuffling of investment portfolios across companies, as we've seen in Australia, with some of the big companies like BHP trying to divest themselves of things like its coal assets, because they don't see any future in those high emission industries. And one of the things that hasn't been reported on much in coming out of Glasgow was the establishment or the announcement of the new International Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, essentially paralleling the financial standards. And this starts to bring in, or the intention is to bring in sustainability accounting in the same way into decision-making as financial accountability occurs. And that has, I think, profound implications for economics and trade right across the globe. And some countries, including, I think, yours and mine, are actually going to be advantaged by this simply because we've got good governance structures that I think can help comply with these new standards. And in terms of climate change, I think it's likely that the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD standards, are likely to be essentially the default approach for climate-related risk under these new accounting standards. And just recapping that, primarily that TCFD approaches looks at physical risk, which is the impacts of climate change, say big storms getting stronger and causing damage and how that may impact on your business. It takes into account transition risk. So that's moving away from high greenhouse gas energy sources, for example, into lower greenhouse gas or renewable energy sources and the implications for risk associated with that, but also in terms of liability risk. So that's things like inappropriate disclosure of your activities or fraudulent disclosure or fraudulent implementation of activities when you've got a problematic risk portfolio or where you actually breach legal requirements. And the last point I'd make is that what we've seen over the last few years is large scale really large scale alliances being formed, particularly in the business and trade domains, which bring together often strange bedfellows and often bring in place new and innovative mechanisms, such as the recent methane pledge, to lower greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time ensure economic growth and employment outcomes and other good outcomes. And I think these both bring opportunities with opening up new arrangements for new technologies and things, but they also bring challenges because we're going to have to think about our business models. We're going to have to invest in research and development, which we haven't in the past. And we're going to have to think about socially responsible business and ESG type businesses in a way we haven't before. And I think that will bring, as I say, both challenges, but for an innovative, fast-moving economy and a nation like New Zealand, I think it will bring significant opportunities. And I'd just like to leave it there, but thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, Mark. This was very concise outline of the main issues and the main proposed policy changes that countries like New Zealand and Australia might be facing soon. So one question I have, and you mentioned it, that the European Union is proposing this carbon border adjustment mechanism. It was proposed last year as part of the European Green Deal. And indeed, it's one of the main policies in which the EU will try to level the playing field, as you said it. So in other words, to prevent carbon leakage, which would happen if the EU prices carbon a lot and then firms might move abroad, or consumers in the EU would just import from outside the European Union to just try to evade those carbon taxes. Now, one of the reasons that the European Union is doing this is to try to get other countries also to get behind the Green Deal in effectively, or also to implement more policy that would reduce carbon emissions. Now, thinking of New Zealand and Australia, well, New Zealand has an emission trading scheme now. Australia used to have one, but doesn't have one anymore. And I think many in the world see Australia as one of the countries most reluctant to make promises, let alone implement policy that would reduce emissions. So what is your view on the perhaps political side of this? Will something like the carbon border adjustment mechanism actually force more policy change in New Zealand and Australia?
I think that's the clear intent of it. I think it's a ratchet mechanism, like they often use within the EU, to ratchet up activities in other jurisdictions. And so I think in a sense, Australia is actually a prime target for that mechanism. And so this is a bit of an arrow being shot at us by the EU. And I think their position is actually defensible in the sense of it's looking out for broader planetary benefit and broader intergenerational benefit. So I sort of understand the ideas behind it. I think the devil will be in the detail of this, as it always is. My own view is that rather than being dragged kicking and screaming into these arrangements, countries like Australia and New Zealand should be proactive. We should actually be positioning ourselves to be leaders rather than being forced into arrangements like this on the terms of other people or other countries or blocks of countries. It makes a lot more sense to actually do this on our own terms rather than the terms of others.
Well, I would agree with you. However, Australia could think, well, fine, let's trade less with the European Union and trade more with China, perhaps. Is that viable, do you think, for the future? Or
well, there's a few problems with that because at the moment our relationships with China are probably a historic low. The sort of Chinese ministers who deal with trade are refusing to even speak with their Australian counterparts, and so the options for opening up new markets there, I think, are pretty limited just at the moment. And so in fact, Australia is actively seeking alternative markets to China, and EU is obviously one of those big markets globally that is very enticing because of its productivity and prosperity there.
Yeah. Now, thinking of the both the similarities and the differences between New Zealand and Australia, you could argue that both countries have sectors that rely a lot on emissions still. Carbon in the case of Australia, because so much of its electricity is generated by coal, which is one of the most dirtiest sources of energy, thinking of carbon emissions. But then there's New Zealand, who has, like you said, a large agricultural and dairy sector, which emits a lot of methane. So both these countries have a lot to lose, I guess, from something like the CBAM. But nevertheless, thinking of the differences then between New Zealand and Australia, it seems that New Zealand is slightly more confident that it can actually reduce those emissions or price those emissions and maintain economic activity at the same time. So what do you think behind the difference in policy in that sense?
I think it comes down to almost like micro politics. So in Australia, the situation we find ourselves actually hinges on politicians elected in a very, very few seats across Australia, and they have the balance of power and have had that balance of power for a considerable time. And this is aligned with very strong essentially lobbying behaviour by the incumbent industries such as the coal mining industry, coal-fired power industries, and so I think what you see there is a very distorted situation in Australia, which is only one possible realisation of many arrangements within Australia, and in a slightly different world, we probably would have ended up in a very different position, one where we would have recognised that climate action is actually economically beneficial for Australia, and that leadership in terms of climate action to avoid the worst futures of climate change, because climate change will hit Australia a lot harder than it will hit New Zealand. It's actually in our interest to be proactive in terms of both emission reductions and also in terms of adaptation. So I think, yes, people should criticise Australia's position. That's my own personal view. But there's a lot of analysis now which actually shows we could go on a very steep emission reduction trajectory and maintain jobs and increase economic productivity. But to do that, we actually have to stop doing some of the things we're currently doing.
Yeah. Well, hopefully more awareness in Australia will help with the political landscape, and perhaps Australia can also think of more policies to help former coal miners find new jobs in renewable industries.
Yeah, absolutely. That equity element is a core part of the considerations, and we've done it before in Australia, and I suspect you've done it in New Zealand. If you look at cities like Newcastle and Wollongong, used to be sort of rust bucket, dirty, steel and coal towns, and they've been transformed into fantastic places to live, cleaned up, great coastlines, very, very pleasant, obviously now clean air. But with really high value jobs, the universities in each of those cities, the research activities in each of those cities. Transition doesn't have to be a bad thing. If it's done well, it can actually advantage everyone.
Yeah, that's a very positive note for the future. So perhaps my last question related to trade is that you mentioned the Cloudbank Declaration, and this proposes. I think you mentioned a limited number of shipping routes, but those that would have the infrastructure that ships could actually be green, which, because they're so large, it's a difficult technology to make renewable. I think you mentioned ammonia, which could be a fuel instead of the heavy oil that's used right now. But that needs a lot of facilities for bunkering, basically, for ships to fill up again. Now, in the near future, I suppose this sounds like an expensive endeavor. A lot of investment is required. So if this is going to be done, then will this not affect, or how will it affect supply chains? Because indeed, Australia and New Zealand are relatively remote, so supply chains and shipping costs will matter a lot more than for other countries.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the biggest shipping line in the world, that's Maersk, have already made the call to move to methanol. So they're already ordered methanol and diesel hybrid ships, and so that they can run off both, and so the technology is there. So it's already there. The challenge for Maersk is or any other country that wants to move to ammonia or methanol is simply getting fuel in enough quantity at the ports that they go to. And that's the thing that Cloudbank declaration was trying to address, amongst other things, but was actually ensuring that the infrastructure was available. Now, without wishing to be at all preemptive, it seems to me really sensible for both Australia and New Zealand to be setting up those types of port facilities. Producing methanol from renewables is actually well-known technology. We've known how to do that for hundreds of years, and it's wood alcohol. That's the original source of this, and so we sort of know how to do this. It's a question of risk, because we don't know which of the energy sources we may flip to. Is it going to be methanol? Is it going to be ammonia? Or some other, there's a whole stack of similar, what we call liquid organic hydrogen carriers. That's essentially a liquid energy carrier. And so which of them is going to be the winner? So there's a sort of a risk component there. There's obviously an infrastructure and setup component. So, is a country like New Zealand or Australia, in a position to, develop that infrastructure given that risk? And lastly, I guess there's the sort of implications for, in the case of geopolitical disruption, where does that leave us with these priority routes and priority fuels that may actually be exposed to geopolitical interference. So I think we do need to think about that, and we also need, as I pointed out earlier, to think about the likely slowing down of shipping due to fuel conservation. And this has already happened. So some of the big lines have already reduced their ship speeds to conserve fuel and to reduce emissions. And so I think, if you've only got a limited shipping stock and your ships are going slower, it just means that there's going to be less material that can be moved, and it's going to hit the port slower than it would otherwise do.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it would be important for a country like New Zealand to get into this initiative, such that those shipping routes will reach New Zealand. And given its hydro and geothermal energy sources, it might be a viable option.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting proposition for countries like Australia and New Zealand. And the iron ore route, for example, from Australia into Asia is a big one. It's a big route on a global scale, and I think that's a great opportunity for us to move into this space. And various people have already identified this as an opportunity. With at the moment they're focusing on hydrogen fueled ships. I'm not convinced that that's the way to go. But I think having a discussion about the alternatives is actually extremely constructive.
Yeah. All right. Yes. Well, thank you very much for this session. A very fascinating talk, and I enjoyed that, and I hope that our listeners did too.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, I hope to meet again in the future.
Cheers. Okay. Hope your conference goes well. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.